All right. My name is Turner Bitton. I'm the secretary here at the Salt Lake Community Network. We're very excited for the presentation tonight. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Rob Ware from Westview Media, I'd just like to lay down some ground rules really quick. You'll notice that this is a webinar function. We expect a large number of folks on the call tonight. Panelists and presenters are labeled as such, and so those are the only folks whose video will be seen. As we get to the Q&A portion, or as the presentation is going, if you have questions yourself, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many audience questions as we can tonight. Due to a mistake that I made, we will not be having a Spanish language version of this town hall tonight. We're going to reschedule that for after the new year, but we will be hosting a Spanish language version of this exact same town hall. I apologize for my scheduling issue, but we appreciate Nick and folks from Salt Lake City who are willing to do both an English and a Spanish language town hall. I would encourage everyone who's watching this on Zoom, if you don't follow the Salt Lake Community Network on Facebook or Westview Media on Facebook, please follow the Facebook pages of our partners, as we'll be hosting more of these in the future. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Turner. Thanks for hosting this. Thanks to the Salt Lake Community Network for putting this together. And thanks, of course, to Nick for joining us from the city. So the purpose of this town hall is going to be to talk about the proposed zoning text amendments related to homeless resource centers and homeless shelters in the city. And Nick Norris is here. He's the planning director from the Salt Lake City Planning Division. He's going to walk us through these changes and explain the initiative, and I think a bit about the intentions behind it and the purpose for it, and what the city hopes to accomplish with it through a presentation. And then that'll be followed by a Q&A session afterwards. And just to remind everyone who's on the video, this is being recorded. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nick now. Nick, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your organization a little bit, and then just go ahead and jump into your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Nick Norris. I'm the planning director for Salt Lake City. I've been with the city since 2007 and been in the role of planning director since 2017. Just a little bit quickly about the planning division, what we do and who we are. We're part of the Department of Community and Neighborhoods, and our role is to help the city manage the community master plans and growth policies and administer zoning and subdivision codes and things like that. So we have a big team to reflect the growing nature of the city and the high demand on growth related issues. And so we're here tonight to talk about one of the functions that we do, which is updates to the city's zoning code. And so we do quite a few of these every single year on different wide variety of topics. And tonight we're here to talk about a change in how the city regulates homeless resource centers and homeless shelters. So with that, I'm going to share my, I guess I can't share my screen. I don't know if somebody wants to do that, so I can.
Turner, can you turn on Nick's screen share?
Yep, my apologies. It should be fixed.
Perfect. So hopefully everybody can see my screen just fine. This project was initiated back in, well, I think it was October now, from Mayor Mendenhall in response to a proposed homeless resource center in the Ballpark neighborhood and on the edge with the Central Ninth neighborhood. And as a result of that, the mayor initiated this proposal to do three things. The first, which is for now the most pressing, is to prohibit the the uses, so homeless resource centers and homeless shelters in the city for the time being. That's a temporary approach and not intended to be long-term in nature. And that'll be the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. And then two other parts. Part two would be updating the regulations that apply to the uses and the approval process. And part three would be to recognize within the zoning code the difference between a permanent facility and a temporary, more seasonal type of facility, which we have and have had for many years, both of those in the city. And then as many people participating tonight know, we've also for the past 3 or 4 years had additional temporary facilities that have been authorized through a specific action by the city council. So I'm going to break this down into each part and talk about each one as we go through this. And then I guess we'll have some time for some questions and from there. So part one, prohibiting new resource centers and homeless shelters, and why we're doing that. And there's a big component to this that we'll get to in a second about the timing. But the primary reason why we're doing it right now is so that we can, without the weight of any proposed facilities over our heads, have some directed conversations with all the stakeholders, community resource center operators, and homeless people who are experiencing homelessness, to consider what those impacts are, consider what the impacts are to the city's resources and services, and update those regulations, and consider perhaps a different approval process. So currently, right now in the city, homeless resource centers are only allowed in 3 zoning districts. They're all shown in red on here. And I should have, when I made this map, we should have used a different color than red for those who may not be able to see that color well. But basically in the CG, which is mostly found along the 300 West corridor and along I-15, fronting along 215 and then along 5600 West, and 2 small little pieces up in West Capitol Hill. The D2, which is kind of the southern downtown area, so from about 600 South to about mid-block between 9 and 1000 South, and the D3, which is primarily around the western part of downtown from North Temple to 500 South, 400 South areas, a little bit scattered on the eastern side of downtown as well. So this first part would only impact those 3 zoning districts. The rest of the zoning districts in the city already do not allow these 3 uses. Existing facilities are not impacted by this change right now, so they continue to operate under the rules that they've been operating under, and it doesn't impact any of the temporary seasonal shelters, emergency shelters, et cetera, that have already been approved and are in the process, that are either operating or in the process of opening. So the rush really is intended because there's a provision in state code that gives cities the ability to push pause on any land use application while they are working on changing the zoning rules. And so it doesn't mean that we can deny those. It means that we can basically put them in a pile and a holding pattern for up to 180 days until we can adopt updated regulations. And so by removing these uses within those 180 days, it gives us more time to analyze and discuss and create those future regulations for homeless resource centers and homeless shelters, without having the potential of new proposals coming in. And so that's why we utilize this 180-day provision. that we can in state code. What happens if we don't adopt something in 180 days? We revert back to the regulations that are in place, and we'd have to process any application for one of these facilities, and we wouldn't be able to further stop that or delay that. We'd have to process it according to the provisions that are in place. And I got a little bit ahead of myself, but so anyone could propose a new homeless shelter or resource center in those three zones, the CG, D2, or D3. And again, we'd have to process that. And we'd be limited to applying the regulations that exist that are on the books right now. So here's the timeline for the first part of this, where we are and where that 180-day period ends. So again, this started in early October. Under our city code, we have a minimum of 45-day engagement period where we send notice to the impacted recognized organizations, which in this case obviously includes all of the community councils and other we do have other recognized organizations that are registered with the city that are not community councils. So those organizations also receive notice. In order to get something adopted by the end of those 180 days, we have a pretty tight time frame. And so we are on schedule to go to the Planning Commission on January 12th to remove those uses from the land use tables. There's a couple of other small changes that we want to make with that, just to ensure that the current regulations still apply once we remove those uses from the land use tables. That would give the city council a couple of months, February and March, to discuss and make a decision. Due to the way the calendar falls, April 2nd doesn't give them really any time in April to adopt something. And so that's why we're pushing that. And again, the entire reason for doing that is so that we can spend more of our efforts focusing on the part 2 and 3, which I mentioned earlier, and which we're about to get into in more detail here. So part 2 is updating the regulations, and why this is important is, as I'm sure most people who follow this issue in the city have seen or heard, is this concern that we have as a city of what the city burden is versus the region burden, and how much of that should we shoulder in Salt Lake City, and how much should be taken on by other entities outside of Salt Lake City. We recognize that our current regulations are not necessarily addressing neighborhood impacts, and so we want to analyze those and hear from people about what those additional impacts are that already aren't regulated by zoning, whether or not zoning is able to address those types of impacts, or if there's better tools, and figure out if there are the things that can be addressed through zoning rules, what can we do and how would those work, and what impacts they have, not just to improve situations, but also to support those people who are experiencing homelessness and the operators and providers of those services to make sure they can still operate and function. We want to consider the overall impact of city services. I think we know that for example, the police department and the fire department and other emergency medical services respond to these types of uses more than most other uses. And so that has a strain on some of our city budgeting. And so we want that to be a factor. We also know that sometimes infrastructure around these types of facilities need to be different than what we may be accustomed to, and require certain budget allocations to address that. And then we also want to have better understanding of data and what's happening with our residents of the city who are experiencing homelessness, and how long they're in that situation, how long they may be staying in a facility, where they're going, where they're from, et cetera. And so we feel like if we can expand and work with the service providers to be able to get access to some of that data and make it more consistent. And when we're receiving it, that we can adjust better as a city and respond more directed and to any kinds of issues that come up. And then finally, we want to improve some of our enforcement tools so that those situations that are coming up and are impacting people that we have, that we're considering what those tools are and trying to apply those and enforce those rules in a way that is productive and produces better outputs and results than what's occurring right now. We know that zoning enforcement is a challenging, slow response to a lot of issues. And so we want to figure out if there's other ways that we can address those types of things. If we are able to remove the uses from the land use tables, then this issue about the 180 days goes away for parts 2 and 3, because no one could propose a new facility in the city because the zoning wouldn't allow it. And so this doesn't become an issue if we can get part 1 moving and adopted before April 2nd. And like I've said earlier, the city is 100% committed to adding the uses back with better regulations and better processes to establish those uses. We want to still act quickly. We don't want to push this off for 12 or 18 months. I think that we still want to get something in the first half of the next calendar year to the council so that we're prepared for next winter and the cold season. But we also want to take the time it takes to get it right and to get it better. So one of the questions that has come up is, since this initiation became known to the community and known to the public, is how can the community and stakeholders be involved? And so we are going to establish a community engagement process for these parts that will start probably, hopefully, in February or March of next year. One of the big differences that we're considering, that we've been researching, is whether or not we can do a different approval process than the conditional use. And one of the reasons for that is that the conditional use process usually doesn't and can't really adequately consider the impact to things like city budgets and other city services and infrastructure outside of the immediate vicinity of a facility. And are there better ways to do it then? Plus, the planning commission, who's the ultimate decision maker on conditional uses, isn't really engaged in that process of understanding the city's budget on the type of level and scale that other entities in the city are. And so that's one of the concerns. And so the approach that we've been looking at is creating what we're calling it's an overlay zoning district for the use. And the idea, at least as it stands right now, is that all the rules and the process for establishing a homeless resource center or homeless shelter would be in that overlay zoning district, but we would not map it, meaning we wouldn't say where it applies until somebody is proposing a new facility, in which case it would go through a zoning map amendment to apply that overlay on top of the base zoning to allow that use subject to whatever regulations are in the process. So there'll be way more to come on that as we get into it in the next few months. And then obviously identifying solutions to the issues that are out there is critical. I don't think any of us pretend or assume that we know what's best. And so we want to hear from people on what the issues are, but equally as important, what the solutions are. We know that zoning isn't going to be able to address every issue that comes up associated with homelessness. And so, but if we know what those issues are, we can start putting those things that can be addressed through zoning into place, and then we can get those other issues into the right categories that can be addressed through other tools and other means. The timeline for this is you'll see it's a couple months slower than the 180-day part 1. We probably will not have any sort of additional work done on this until February, just given some of the critical needs and things that we are also working on in the planning division. But we hope to have something available in January as far as what the plan is for community engagement and how people can be involved and who's involved, and making sure we're getting the right stakeholders at the table to help with those kinds of things. So we can look forward to that sometime, hopefully in February and March. That's the goal. Obviously, that might be subject to change a little bit, but we'll see how things shake out over the next 2 months until we get to February. We hope to have a draft proposal sometime towards the end of February, and there'll be an additional opportunity for public response and input to that. On this timeline, that would be in May. And then in June, we'd go to the Planning Commission. I failed to mention earlier that, and probably many people in this meeting know this, but for those that don't, the Planning Commission is required under state code to make a recommendation on any zoning change to the City Council. So that has to be that legally has to be the first step. It's not a final decision by the Planning Commission. It simply is a recommendation, and there's opportunities during the Planning Commission process for the public to weigh in on proposals directly to the Planning Commission through public hearings. And then after that, we'll get something to the council, and the council will take whatever time they deem is necessary to be able to absorb the issues, hear from people, make changes if they feel that's warranted, and then ultimately and hopefully adopt something different. And then part 3 is a little bit more complicated. And stepping back before we get into part 3, a big part of part 2 in that overlay will include some kind of parameters and considerations for how much of the homeless services are in the city and how much are out of the city. And there'll be some criteria that the City Council can weigh when making a decision on a proposal to locate a new facility in the city. So that will also be in part 3. But so let's get to part 3. The main focus here is to really differentiate between those facilities that are more seasonal and emergency in nature, temporary, and those that are more permanent, intended to be there until such time as they're not. And they serve different needs and different, have different impacts and different goals too, frankly. And so what we hope to be able to accomplish is a discussion about what those are, some things that may end up in a future, in the zoning code in the future, to differentiate maybe different definitions. So clearly defining what a temporary facility is. More than likely, a temporary facility would have some slightly different regulations just because of the nature of what they're doing and how they would fit in. But also considering an approval process and whether or not a different approval process than what the City Council has been doing for the last few years is better or not. And for those that don't know, they use their power as the City Council to adopt temporary land use regulations to authorize the seasonal emergency shelters in those zoning districts where the shelters either aren't allowed, or when they are allowed to, because time is usually of the essence in these types of decisions, to eliminate the need to go through the conditional use process. So that will be part of what we're looking at in this when we're differentiating between temporary and permanent. The City Council recognized this when they adopted the temporary regulations for the seasonal emergency facility on North Temple and Redwood Road. And this really gets at the heart of one of the things that I think collectively all of us, not just the city, but I think a lot of our residents and business owners are concerned with, is what is the fair share of the city versus what other jurisdictions in the council use Salt Lake County, but we know it's a bigger, more regional, and Davis County is right on the border of Salt Lake. So it's not much different if it's Davis County or Salt Lake County, but identifying what that fair share is and essentially prohibiting future uses until temporary uses until there are some other temporary facilities outside of Salt Lake City. So again, the timeline with this is the same right now as the other part two. We think a lot of the issues are going to be very similar. Whether or not we'll have the resources to be able to have those two conversations, or if they need to be separated, we don't know. We're going to kind of play that by ear and see how it goes. But for now, we want to try to keep those on the same track. So we're having more of a comprehensive discussion instead of trying to separate those out. But we're prepared to do either. And so we'll see how that goes and how it works. But again, it's the same type of thing. February, March, we'll go through our initial community dialogue and input. Even things that we're already hearing contribute to that as well. So it's not like we're not going to hear or take any comments until then, but that's when we are going to do most of our focused conversations. We'll draft a proposal ideally in April, and then it'll go through a public response and input period in May, and then on to the Planning Commission. And so the good thing is that this presentation is pretty short, so hopefully it leaves plenty of time for any sort of comments or questions. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Rob.
And I'm going to unmute. Great. Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Nick. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the other documentation you provided. I think as Turner mentioned in the chat, this information is all available through the city's website. And again, we'll show that that web address again before we wrap this up. And again, this is all being recorded, so you will be able to revisit this and see answer any of Nick's answers to questions, or see any of the reference information that you need to see. Again, and thanks again to Turner for monitoring the questions and feeding them into us, and for Jasmine Walton. I think she's also joined us from NeighborWorks Salt Lake, and she's also a board member of Westview Media. So thanks to Jasmine also for helping to kind of produce this behind the scenes. Thanks so much for doing that. So Nick, we do have the questions are starting to roll in. So let's just get started with those now. So one question that I had immediately, and this may be like really elementary for anyone who's interested in this process and this topic, but you had mentioned the 3 different zoning designations where homeless resources are currently allowed. How are those defined? Is it based on location? Is it based on use? Is it a combination of those things?
Yeah, it's based on a couple of things and a combination of those things. And so the entire city is divided into zoning districts, and each zoning district includes a list of land uses that are allowed, and they're either allowed as permitted, what's called permitted uses, or conditional uses. And so for these 2 uses, for a long time, homeless shelters were allowed in those 3 zones, really dating back to when those 3 zones were created back in 1995. And prior to that, they were allowed in zones that were in those general areas as well. And the city's policies back in the day were to concentrate services, with the idea being that it was easier to provide those services when they were concentrated. Since we know, basically since the number of people experiencing homelessness has grown dramatically, not just in our area over the last decades, but really all over the country. I think we've recognized that concentrating has profound impacts, and so excuse me, that's part of what we want to discuss through this process, is what does that look like if we're not concentrating them. And 5 years or so ago, when the city took the approach of this more of the scattered model approach, with the 3 new homeless resource centers, not just the city, but really the state and county as well, the idea was that it would be better off if things weren't concentrated. And so now we're trying to focus that discussion in Salt Lake City and what that means for our city. And just as I talk about what's the fair share of homeless services provided within Salt Lake City, part of that discussion needs to be more focused and even to the point of what is the fair share within each neighborhood of the city. And so those are all things that we're going to hopefully address through the process of adding the regulations back in.
Yeah, actually, that was so. I think you started to answer some of the questions that I was leading into with that. But I know that the mayor has expressed frustrations with that, and the map clearly shows, for anybody who couldn't read the map or couldn't see it, it clearly shows concentration in specific areas of the city. And I think that yeah, that definitely shows, right, when it comes to the type of input that people are providing. And a lot of the questions we're seeing are rooted specifically in that idea of the scattered site model and worries about fair housing law, and whether or not fair housing law would prevent the density stipulations you'd kind of mentioned. We actually had a question come in from Amy Hawkins, the chair of the Ballpark Community Council. It was on, it was a question kind of proposed by the Ballpark and the Central Ninth leadership that was about whether or not you were specifically committing now to codifying the anti-density stipulations into the zoning revisions. Like, are you actually planning to do that now, or is that still kind of up in the air?
I think that's up in the air. I think as we go through this, I mean, there's a number of potential legal questions with what we're doing, right? And anytime we're starting to touch those federal laws, like fair housing laws, we want to make sure that we are not opening up the city to any kind of housing discrimination. And so we will certainly be including the city's legal team on whatever proposal we come up with. And so I don't know the answer to that question right now, right? That's something that we're going to have to rely on our land use attorneys and the city attorney's office for. But we certainly want to have that conversation, and we want to hear from people about those issues so that we can come up with things. I think there's a lot of people who would love to see some sort of a spacing requirement. Whether or not we can do that, I don't fully know that. And so I would be hesitant to make assumptions in an answer there. But it's something we want to research.
Based on the literature that's been published about this process so far, and a lot of what you've said, it seems like that impulse to try to spread this, spread the burden of addressing this issue around more, both in terms of like you had said, inside the city itself, around the different council districts, and also in neighboring cities and with the county kind of chipping in. Seems like it's kind of it feels like that idea has been driving a lot of this process. So is it fair to assume that is it fair to assume that codifying those anti-density stipulations is actually going to happen? I know I'm sorry I'm kind of pushing on this, and maybe you can't say any more about it, but it is fueling a lot of the questions we're getting.
I think, well, yeah, and I totally get that. And I think the only way I can really answer that, I mean, I'd love to be able to say yes or no, right? But I don't know that I can. And I think what we want to be able to do is seriously look at what that means, and if there's ways that we can ensure that we can spread the impacts around to other neighborhoods versus the ones that seem to be shouldering a lot of that impact right now. I think part of it is ensuring that we're putting things in place that further the city's goals of a housing first approach to homelessness. That's still the number one goal. And that is going to require a citywide effort, right? We know that we're not going to be able to accomplish it by putting the housing that's most accessible to people coming out of homelessness all in one neighborhood. It's going to have, that's not going to be an appropriate thing to do either. And that, so there's probably some ancillary spin-off types of zoning changes that will help with that part. But, you know, we have to have those conversations. And I think anything should be on the table. I mean, it doesn't hurt to talk, right? And if we can do those things and we can get some input from our attorney's office on what we can and can't do as a city and what kinds of legal exposure we're going to have if we decide to go down certain approaches, we'll have those conversations and see where they land.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Now we're gonna turn to some more audience questions. Now we're gonna kind of jump around a bit. One audience member asks, what impact the ACLU lawsuits in the Bell versus Boise decision have had on the approach to this? Yeah, it sounds like it's had an impact. So the questioner provides a little context, and I'm just going to read that. It's a very complex question that implies rules that have to be followed in terms of shelters in order to force people off of the streets. For instance, Main Street, loss of commerce based on open drug use by homeless people, impacting the businesses, the loitering. Yeah, how has Bell versus Boise maybe specifically impacted this process?
You know, at this point, I don't think it's impacted this process. It's definitely something that we're well aware of. And it gets back to one of those things that whenever we're writing any kind of zoning proposal or zoning change, we consider not only applicable state and federal laws, but also court decisions, just to make sure that we're not violating any of those types of things too. So it is going to be an insanely complex issue to address. We know that, but until we start having actual written proposals, it's really hard to say how a court case is going to impact us. It may help us avoid certain things and going down certain paths, especially when there's things that have already been ruled. For not that this is part of this, but for example, we know that there's a federal law that addresses zoning and how it impacts religious institutions. And part of that is that if a religious institution wants to operate a homeless shelter, then, we can't prohibit that under local zoning. And so those are the types of things that we want to make sure that we're aware of and that we're considering, and we do an analysis of whatever comes out of our community dialogues and whatever ends up in that proposed ordinance come next April.
So we have another question kind of along legal lines here. Of course, we have a few, but it sort of ties into that idea of trying to balance legal needs with community input, and then of course all the other considerations going into this. But one of the attendees is asking, have density restrictions ever been challenged in the courts? And maybe is the city being too timid in this approach and potentially going to find themselves with another Rio Grande fiasco?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the density restrictions have been challenged. I do know that concentrating has, and so that's kind of the same thing, right? But it's maybe an opposite approach, is that when there have been some places, I think it was in California, where there were a city that was concentrating their homeless shelters in one area, and I believe that there was a lawsuit filed, but I believe the state legislature addressed that and prohibited cities from concentrating them. Interestingly enough, there is a spacing requirement in California code about homeless resource centers, but it's really small. It's 300 feet. And so that's not really changing impacts, right? And so, I just don't know about that, about whether they've been challenged, but we can certainly ask our attorneys to do some, and their legal teams to do some research about if that has been addressed in a court case.
Thanks. Yeah, there's of course, some more legal questions. So I think we might stick with that thread for a little bit as we kind of go through this. Another attendee is asking, is if the city is taking the stance that proximity restrictions violate the Fair Housing Act, does that necessarily define the shelters as housing? And in that case, should the city allow shelters in residential zones?
Um, it does mean that shelters are considered a type of housing. I think that's already established within the Fair Housing Act and some court cases. But as far as just because a type of housing is defined, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be allowed everywhere, right? So just even there may be some residential zones where it's appropriate. I don't know that. I think if when it comes down to it, I think it's going to be really hard for the city to pick and choose which zoning districts these should be allowed in. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're going down this path of an overlay zone and then having the council map it when something's proposed, because that seems to address the underlying zoning issue, and gives the council a little bit more authority and leeway in citing those.
So just to be clear, it does sound like this process is not only kind of accepting the fact that these resource centers and shelters will likely be located in residential areas going forward, but almost planning on that.
Well, I don't know that. I don't speak for the council, and I don't speak for someone who may propose something, right? And I think there's some logistic realities about things, right? Obviously, a piece of property has to be of a certain size to accommodate the use. That alone doesn't necessarily eliminate a lot of residential zones, but it makes it a lot harder for people to assemble property and do it. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. And so I think I would be hesitant to say it assumes that they're going to be in residential areas, because I think that's a big leap. But if we take this overlay approach and it becomes more of a discussion about, is this site appropriate, then I certainly think it's possible that there probably are some very large parcels that are zoned residential that may have old schools or churches and things on them that it might be appropriate.
So if that's the case, and that does happen, and it does feel like more and more that's a much more viable possibility. One listener is asking, how do we know that mitigation measures will always be enforced, and the communities hosting the shelters, that their concerns won't be ignored, and that it won't turn into a drastic transformation of the neighborhood because the concerns aren't being enforced?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's when I talk about identifying the issues and identifying those things that can be regulated by zoning and those that can't. And if we try to regulate something through zoning that just is not enforceable through zoning, it's not going to work. And I think we know that. And so, and there's plenty of evidence to that. And so that's why we want to have these discussions about what our current regulations are, and what's missing from those regulations, what could be improved, what works, and then go from there. And that includes discussing the city's approach to enforcement, I think. And so, if a homeless resource center goes into a new location, does that mean that maybe we're more proactive about zoning enforcement in those areas? It might, right? That's going to be a decision for those people who determine what resources go where in the city. I don't oversee the enforcement function, so I can't commit to and necessarily comment on whether that would change. I mean, they have to have the tools, they have to have the manpower, and they have to have the resources to be able to be proactive. And so it's a different approach, but if that's one of those things that comes out of this process is that there needs to be that different approach, then we certainly as a city should have that conversation and see what we can do about it.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation that a big part of this process, or maybe potentially one of the issues with like the existing conditional use process, is that it doesn't consider necessarily the cost and the needs outside of the space of the facility. So I guess maybe like I think a lot of the people watching here, of course, were concerned about, about whether or not this is going to take into consideration, the needs of the surrounding community. But it sounds like this process is trying to hard bake that into any like regulatory.
Yeah, and I think there definitely is some reality that the conditional use process is set up to address the types of impacts that are things like noise and odor from where garbage is stored at restaurants to lights shining in and those kinds of things. It's not a great tool to deal with some of the issues and impacts that are created by some land uses, right? I think as a city we're experiencing some of that, and I think other cities across the country are experiencing some of that as well. And so I think part of this process is recognizing that conditional uses work when the impacts are something that can be reasonably addressed, right? They don't work with it's an impact that goes way beyond that. And when it comes to these types of uses, I think one of the considerations is, how much of that impact is the responsibility of that provider of that use and operator of that use versus how much of the impact is more of the nature of homelessness in the city. And is that operator responsible for that big totality of homeless issues, or just those homeless issues created by their facility? And I think that's a hard thing to separate. And so I think that's one of the things that when I talk about things that zoning can address and things that zoning can address, that's what we want to get on the table so that we can be more realistic about what we're doing.
Yeah, and actually, I think in the sort of proposed regulation updates for this, there are a lot of sort of expanded security and expanded facilities maintenance regulations in there that frankly I'm surprised we're not already kind of in the code. So it seems like the process is trying to build those regulations into effect, but one audience member has pointed out that like you said, like as far as enforcement goes, you can only write so much into the code, and then it depends on both the facility and the enforcement from the administration, correct? So is there a risk that with enforcement likely to vary from, between administrations, that establishing these sort of non-traditional, if I can call it that, locations for homeless resource centers, is there a risk that those could eventually become that the regulations you're trying to set up could eventually become lax depending on whatever administration is in office?
That's certainly a possibility. And I think that possibility exists whether we do this or not, right? If we keep things the same, that possibility is still out there. If we change it, that possibility is still out there. And so I think what we can do, though, that if we can establish improved regulations that are easier to enforce and require less resources to enforce, they tend to be enforced. It's a lot of times it's those things that are either resource intensive, are really challenging to enforce. I think everybody probably on this call understands some of the issues of enforcing around short-term rentals, or at least knows that that's an issue, right? And sometimes cities are hamstrung by what they can enforce and can't enforce, which gets back to the Boise case. And so I think what we want to do is make sure that the more clear the standards are in the code and the more directly that they apply. And if we can utilize the different tools than just the conditional use process, then we might, and I would say probably, have a better shot at having more consistent enforcement across administrations than if we keep things as they are.
Another question this one's from Richard Holman from the West Side Coalition. He's submitted a couple of questions so far. He asks about going back to the idea of residential zones potentially being hosts to these resource centers and shelters. He's worried about whether or not that's going to be spread across the city, or if it's going to be as the current map kind of suggests, is it going to be located only in specific parts of the city? Like how much equity is there going to be in which locations, which districts, which neighborhoods are being asked to host these things? And is that going to be something is that sort of equity of distribution going to be stipulated?
I would hope so. If I have my preference, I would include something in a provision that's a factor in considering where future shelters would go. The regulation should apply equitably. We know that zoning has a long history of creating inequities, and we recognize that. We've pledged to do what we can within our authority in the planning division to address equity issues when we're considering regulations, and that certainly is up there at the top of the list. Is if we continue to put some of these more challenging uses all in the same neighborhoods, we're doing those neighborhoods a disservice, and we're impacting a lot of people who have historically been marginalized by zoning, and so we want to avoid that. And again, that's ultimately going to be up to city council what goes in there, but I would imagine that there will be support for having some sort of factor included in that overlay that deals with that.
Another question. This one's sort of a tangent to the line that we've been on. Nigel Swaby, sorry, Nigel, asks about. He's asking about SRO zoning, and whether or not SRO zoning overlays would provide additional affordable housing throughout the city. And he's wondering if you think SROs are a valuable tool to address homelessness.
100%. So I think we all know that. I mean, if you trace like the growth in homelessness back through time, and some of the first things that happened is that zoning started to zone out a lot of these types of uses that were the cheapest and most accessible to those people who made next zero or virtually no money, right? When you used to be able to get an SRO unit for dollars per night, it was a much different story. And we know in Salt Lake City that back in the day we had I think roughly right around 1,000 SRO units in the city, and to where now we have one SRO facility, the old Rio Grande Hotel, which I think has less than 50 SRO units in it. And so we absolutely know that eliminating those uses like that have contributed to homelessness, and because it's one less housing option that's out there. And so, we do hear a lot about SROs in terms of whether they're safe and whether they're the right type of housing to provide. And I think they can certainly be safe, right? That comes down to how they're operated and managed. And they certainly are better, are more than likely better for individuals than being in a homeless shelter or being out without any shelter. And so I think yes, absolutely yes, that is a necessity, not just in Salt Lake City, but in the region, and every city across the country needs more of that type of housing.
So it seems like, again, to come back to this idea, it seems like a lot of this process is kind of focused on less on just zooming in on shelters and resource centers, and more on trying to expand, to like a more holistic consideration that it's not just a building or a neighborhood or even a city, but also the county, multiple cities participating, right? And it seems like this idea of SROs is, it works with that in a way that it identifies that that just thinking about the problem in isolation, like you were saying, is sort of, it's maybe not sufficient, or it's not as effective at trying to provide solutions as it could be. Is there a possibility that SROs could actually be baked into homeless policy as a way to sort of address the bigger picture, rather than just addressing kind of the symptoms, if that makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is a holistic approach. It can't be just one thing here and one thing there. It has to be a a housing first approach. And there's plenty of models out there that, including frankly locally, where that hasn't been implemented, and we know what the results are. And so it's, it's kind of maddening, would be maddening for a city to go down that same approach. And so of not taking the homeless first. But we also, if we look to other parts of the world, there are countries and places that have essentially eliminated homelessness because of a homeless first approach. And they've been very proactive about it. And, part of that, at least in Salt Lake City, is making sure that we're allowing and permitting easily a broad range of housing types. And that's in every zoning district, right? And, it could be everything from, right now, zoning limits the number of people that can rent out a single house to 3. And, is that really the right policy for us to have when we have some of these issues that we're having with housing affordability? And we know that boarding houses and rooming houses and lodging hotels and things like that are next to extinct in many places. And so and a lot of that is because of zoning. And so if we add those uses back in, it at least gives us those tools. It doesn't mean everywhere is going to have them, right? Not every property owner is going to want to do that with have one of those housing types on their property, but some will. And one thing that we do know when it comes to housing is that if we're relying solely on big apartment buildings and things like that to address our housing issues, it's not going to help. And so we do know that we need more housing types so that individual property owners, without really any expense, can have more flexibility with how they're using their property for housing. And so I think those are some zoning reforms that are bigger picture that need to occur. Some are proposed and some are sitting waiting for, like our updated SRO proposal is waiting for the council to act on it. And so we're working on a lot of those types of things, but it needs to be comprehensive.
Yeah, I think Nigel posted a follow-up question. I think he mentioned the updated SRO. Maybe he says a project was approved earlier this week. Maybe the updated SRO is in response to that. But he's talking about how it was basically quite negatively received, and he's asking how we can get better at explaining the benefits of SROs. Is that something that whose responsibility is that? Is your office engaged in necessarily in this kind of explanatory outreach, like this educational corrective, or do you design the policies and then hand them off to the administrators to implement?
No, we are involved, and I think as with most big issues, it takes a village, right? And so I think from a city perspective, it can't just be the planning division, it can't just be RDA, it can't just be housing stability. It's got to be a collective, and I think everybody has to contribute to that. Even like our enforcement team, our permits office, and how long is it taking to get permits out the door that to build the essential housing and things like that. And so it's not just us, but absolutely, I think when we take a more collective approach and involve more, we tend to be better at messaging and getting those things out. And we've tried to do that. I think we can probably improve how we do that. And, hopefully that's one of the positives that come out of this process is, not just the regulations, but how do we talk about those regulations, and how do we have those conversations in a meaningful way?
Yeah, it's built into the process, right? There are multiple sort of comment and feedback opportunities. The first is in February, March, the community engagement. And then the second in May is the public input period. What's different between those two? And
one is, so the February and March, the first period, really is getting everything out on the table, having those discussions, trying to figure out what needs to be included, what zoning can do, what it can't do. And then the second period, that May 2022 on the timeline, is basically a response to the regulation. So we'll take that input from the first period, draft regulations, put that back out there so that people can see it, we can start to have conversations about, well, how would this regulation be enforced? What does this really mean? Those kinds of things. And then we can adjust as we go. And that's the part that oftentimes takes a little bit longer than I would be, frankly, I'll be shocked if we were able to have that done in a month. But it's that's more of like the actual like sausage making type of thing that is a lot more complex and a lot harder and involves our legal team a lot more, but also is harder to talk about with the community, right? It's not like reading laws is really fun for anyone, unless you're kind of crazy, but and I put myself in the crazy category. But anyway, that'll probably take longer than a month, but we'll see how it goes. And that's the goal, is to be able to get that input and improve that code so that it works as best it can, given the city's resources that it has available.
Yeah, so lots of different, that's the law versus the public input versus the city needs versus what's even possible, right? So lots of things to factor in, but one that we haven't talked about yet, and a user, Nicholas Hogg, it looks like, brought this up, asking if there's going to be any requirements for factoring in crime levels in a given area, like with any proposed area to have, like a crime level below a certain level.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we'll be looking at, and hopefully we can get that data from our police department and in a way that is useful for the conversation. But we think there's a lot of things that could be factors for locating future facilities, that included. And so, it's access to healthcare, it's access to jobs, it's access to transportation and things like that. And, also what other kinds of partners are out there that may be able to contribute to the success of a future facility. I don't know that we necessarily know that right now, what that might be, but for example, if there's a university with like a social work program, maybe those grad students could have some kind of a program associated with a future facility because it's close to where they're studying already. So things like that. Those are all things that we want to look at.
Yeah, so again, that comes back to that idea of a more holistic approach, right? And are those things not typically factored into these decisions right now? I mean, because I guess they must not be, right? Because there's such a limited scope of locations that are actually viable to host a resource center or a shelter, correct?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know that I know that. I don't know that I've really considered that.
That's fair. So another question about how the overlay works, which I think this is a great question too, because frankly, I'm actually a little bit uncertain about this myself. One of the attendees says that they're confused about how the overlay works. Could it be in any zoned area in any council district anywhere? Like, are there any no-go like zoning designations, or could it be anywhere?
There probably are some no-go zoning designations, but those are going to be zoning designations like natural open space. And we probably don't want a homeless resource center in our extractive industry zone, right? Or around our heavy industrial areas. And so, but other than that, basically how an overlay works is that in this case is that there'd be specific regulations for these specific uses. And the best way to think of it is those regulations would sit on top of, if they were mapped, would sit on top of any base zoning district. And so, for example, let's just take the institutional zone, right? Because that may be one of those zones where a homeless resource center isn't currently allowed that may be appropriate. And so it will have things like building height regulations and setbacks and all those things. Those things would probably still apply. But if this overlay were to be mapped on top of that, it basically means, okay, this use can go there subject to complying with all those height, setbacks, et cetera, plus this other group of regulations. And so only the city council could map the overlay. no one in the administration can. It's considered a legislative function that is reserved by the city council.
Okay, so it's not so much it's not a carve out or like a special drop in. It's built on. So it's a combination of all of the, and then like those overlays would then be a combination of multiple layers of zoning restrictions instead of just like removing one set and dropping another set in.
Yeah.
Okay. I know we kind of have gone over the 7 o'clock mark, so maybe just one more quick question here.
Rob, let's go ahead and get to every question that's currently in the chat.
Okay.
We cut it off at 7, but we'll answer the remaining ones.
Okay. So then this is sort of I think related to that idea of a more equitable distribution of resource center locations. Looks like Christian Harris, maybe Christian Harris, I think it is, asks, by leaning into a citywide overlay that then uses city council oversight, like you were just saying, to give specific permissions, does that potentially disadvantage neighborhoods without as much political clout? And Christian Harrison is from the Downtown Community Council.
Yeah, I think that gets back to that question about equity and how it would be applied. And obviously you can't speak for future councils, but I think if we can put various factors in there to address that and make it less likely to occur, we're going to be better off. And I don't know that there's a way to require or tie the hands of future councils, because they can always change the rules, right? And so you put things in and you do what you can, and hopefully we can have enough factors in there that address equity and spreading the impact around more. And if we can do that, then I'm would be less concerned about that happening. I think that's definitely, I mean, that's a reality we see with many land use decisions, right? And you'll hear people say comments about how a use belongs in a certain neighborhood and not this neighborhood type of thing, and that's something that we try to, at least in the planning division, we try to steer away from those kinds of comments, because they're not helpful, right? They don't produce better outcomes. They don't lift other neighborhoods, and it creates that separation and segregation, something that we don't support, promoting that kind of conversation.
Yeah, so this is a topic that we kind of touched on a little bit, just a quick follow-up on that idea, about trying to build in rules that sort of are broader than just focused on the institutional needs of like a building or a location or a parking lot or whatever. Is it possible to codify that and to make that part of these new regulations, so that different administrations can't just decide based on what they want to do, but they have to follow those distribution requirements?
Yeah, I think there's probably some ways to do that. I think part of this process will lead us down that path. I think that's one of our goals, is how do we do that, and how do we get something in place that can be better down the road than what we've been doing. And I think if we can do that, all we can do is hope to get that done and put something in place that works now, and hoping it stands the test of time. But we also would be foolish not to expect changes down the road, right? And so I think it gets back to how many of those factors you can get in there that really touch on equity and try to break down the the segregation that's occurred because of how zoning has worked historically. And so I think if we can do those kinds of things, get factors into our code that address that, not just with homeless resource centers, but also other housing types, then we're less likely to see that outcome, that negative outcome.
So you mentioned that it would be foolish to not accept changes down the road. Is this process, does it already have a built-in plan to revisit these proposals? Like, what would that look like? What are the timetables on that?
Well, you don't know, right? I think in every city that functions well from a land use and planning perspective takes the time to analyze what's working and what doesn't, and they build that into their how they allocate resources to those functions. And so, our city started to do that. And so I think, you don't really know. Some things probably are going to work for 20 or 30 years. You don't really need to revisit them. Others, I mean, I know there's things in our code that we've put in there, in the not too distant past that probably need to be improved. And I think community does too. And so it really is about making sure that you have that capacity to do that. And that's recognized as part of what the planning process is looking at those and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, and being nimble enough to make changes when something isn't working or having the desired outcome.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks. So one more question now. I think this sort of ties into that answer. And I think it's also a nice thing to lead on because I think it'll give, or a nice thing to end on, because I think it can give a lot of participants ideas for kind of looking into other models and helping them to formulate their questions and their feedback that they can then submit through the appropriate feedback comment section of this process. This is again from Richard Holman. He asks, how much have we evaluated other cities' approaches? He says that he mentioned specifically protected camping as something that other cities have had some success with, but what else besides protective camping? Like what have you seen in other cities that you think would be really valuable for Salt Lake to emulate?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's starting to happen, and I know we're going down this path a little bit with the tiny home village that's going through the process right now, but other cities are starting to have quite a bit of success with different models using those kind of more portable individual small housing units, and even placing them on on unused parking lots and things like that, and dealing with that. But it gets back to what I was saying earlier about the more tools you have, the more options you have, the better results you're going to get. And if you're only relying on one model to address an issue, what your results are going to be. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think recently the city of Los Angeles, which anyone who's been there in the last few years fully understands the level of criticalness of their homeless issues. But they're starting to do some things like having those, converting those parking lots and other facilities and other, uses to provide more appropriate shelter for people. And, there's other cities that have taken approaches of addressing these more communal housing types, like we've talked about, and making those easier to process. And by easier to process doesn't mean that they're not well regulated. They still are well regulated, but they're just easier to establish subject to those regulations. And so I think there's all kinds of things out there that people can do. And like I said, if we're focused on trying to just use one tool, we're not going to be successful as a city. And so it gets back to that being comprehensive, having as many tools as we possibly can produces better outcomes.
Looks like we have one more question drop into the Q&A from Dennis Ferris. It's more of a comment, actually. He brings up Helsinki in Finland, which he says has taken amazing steps toward ending homelessness. I guess largely by investing in housing. Yep. You kind of mentioned that as another way to address this. We talked a little bit about the SROs. We talked about some of the other investments we can make, and of course this whole idea is investing in certain types of housing. What is there? Do you have any? I know this is kind of a very specific scenario, or like a very specific city to ask about. But are there any takeaways from the Helsinki model that you have in the front of your mind?
Yeah.
You could address?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they have taken a very the right word is escaping me, but they've taken extreme measures to take a housing first approach to things. And obviously anytime you take a lesson from particularly a foreign country, you have to take them with some caveats, right? I mean, they have different forms of government, different tools, but the ability to take that and try to make it, mold it to work within our structure and our environment here from a government perspective and financing perspective and taxing perspective and all those types of things and ownership perspectives. There's ways to do it, and Helsinki is one of those. There's cities in Austria that have also done amazing things with a housing first approach. And so I think we can look at those. We can always learn from other places. And, I think frankly, in the United States, we're a little bit behind on these issues, and we have been for, 40 years now. And so I think it's going to be hard, right? Nothing we're going to do is going to suddenly change it overnight. We know that. But we need to be able to, like I said, be nimble about the changes we're making, and with the ultimate goal of a housing first approach.
Yeah, so it sounds like in general, I think you're suggesting, and I think a lot of people would agree in this conversation, that we as a community and as a broader country are very much behind solutions that are being used, in different cities in the U.S. and then also in cities around the world. And you talked often about the importance of being nimble and being able to respond. Would it be beneficial to build in a recurring reassessment time period into these regulations, so that every 1 or 2 years they would, there'd be kind of a forced audit, a required audit of these things in order to find out what, maybe Helsinki came up with something new that we could implement that would really be helpful.
Yeah, no, I think there's value in doing those kinds of things. There's risk too, right? I mean, you have to have the resources to be able to do that audit and to do that analysis. And I think it's one thing to say every 2 years we're going to do this, because we don't know what's going to come up, right? I mean, we've just experienced we're pushing almost 2 years of being in this pandemic, and in June of 2019, no one probably would have thought where we are now and some of the issues that we're facing and as the world really. But I think yes, it makes a lot of sense to do that, provided there's commitment to do it.
And I guess that's the big takeaway. A lot of the stuff makes a lot of sense, but we need to have whole community commitment in order to move forward and make these changes. All right, Nick Norris, Planning Director with Salt Lake City Planning Division. Thank you for taking the time to give this presentation and to kind of walk us through and answer a lot of these questions. Really, really generous of you to sit down with us and talk to kind of get this process, to kind of advance this process. Thanks also to Turner Bitten, who is kind of producing behind the scenes from the Salt Lake Community Network, and of course Jasmine Walton, who's also in there producing from NeighborWorks Salt Lake and as part of the Westview Media Board. Turner, if you want to talk about the logistics of how this is going to be available to other people in the future, where they can find it, where they can find the links and the information, I'll turn the time over to you to close us out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We will post a recording of this town hall on Vimeo, and we'll make that link available to all the community councils and to the public within the next 24 hours. I just have to edit it and do some small edits to the video. Pay attention, watch Salt Lake City Network or Salt Lake Community Network for information about the Spanish version of this town hall and for future town halls on different topics. Thank you, Rob, for moderating. Thank you, Nick, for your time tonight. We're going to go ahead and end the live stream. Thanks, everybody.